Facts don't lie. Only 40% of registered voters in Oklahoma went to the polls in the 2014 general election. That was 9 points lower than in 2010 and reflected the lowest total number of voters in a gubernatorial election year since 1978. Fewer voters turn out in non-presidential election years, but still, citizen involvement in government and policy is a concern in the U.S. and in Oklahoma. A nonpartisan group called Voice of the People has launched a new effort to give the American people a more effective voice in government by establishing citizen cabinets. And Oklahoma is one of 3 states chosen for the pilot phase. Earlier, I spoke with Stephen Call, founder and president of Voice of the People, about the project. Stephen, why did you develop the concept of the citizen cabinet?
Well, the way this happened was for many years, over 2 decades, I was doing polls and focus groups asking people what they thought about public policy issues. And what I found was that no matter what they wanted to talk about, what I wanted to ask them about, what they really wanted to talk about was how frustrated they were with government. And when I probed into it, what I found was the pervasive feeling that government isn't hearing from the people, that it only hears from the special interests. And they felt that this was really in violation of the original vision of the founders. So we gradually developed a method for trying to give the people a greater voice in public policy so that government can really hear what the people have to say about the decisions that are being made by government, particularly in Congress.
Briefly, how do you see the citizen cabinet operating?
Well, what's really key is that we're not just asking people for off-the-cuff responses. What we do is we take people through a process called a policy-making simulation that puts them in the shoes of policymakers. So they get a briefing on an issue, they are presented policy options, they hear arguments pro and con on each policy option, and ultimately they make their recommendations, often in a context where they have to deal with trade-offs. And everything that they're presented, the entire policy-making simulation, is vetted with congressional staffers from both parties as well as outside groups that they have across the whole spectrum of opinion, so that people know that this is really a balanced presentation of the issue, and so that they can really make their recommendations with the kind of information that members have. Now, the idea of the citizen cabinet, we found that members of Congress say, well, if I just give them national data, they say, well, that's interesting, but what about my people? I really need to know what my constituents think. So the idea of the citizen cabinet is that we will have a panel of people in each state and district that will go through these processes, so we can then turn around and give that information to the senators and to the House members that represent them.
Voice of the People is nonpartisan. Who is supporting this project?
A variety of foundations, the Democracy Fund, Rockefeller Brothers Fund, the Hewlett Foundation, and these are foundations that are really committed to the idea of improving democracy, and they're not committed to any particular standpoint on any of the issues. And we take no position on the issues. Our only position is that the people should be heard in the public policy process.
You established one of the first citizen cabinets in Oklahoma. Why here?
Well, we wanted to pick a very Republican state, a very Democratic state, and then a swing state. And Oklahoma is the very Republican state. It's in the West. Tom Cole, one of your members of Congress, showed a lot of interest in it, and so we were interested in working with him, and so we set up a citizen cabinet specifically in Oklahoma as well.
Now, other states have been involved in this. What have you learned from them, and what have you learned from Oklahoma?
Well, what's really striking is how really when people sit down and they're not thinking in terms of a partisan framework, but they're really thinking in terms of the issues, and they reason about it, what we generally find is that people tend to find common ground. And though we have some very different districts and states in this picture, we found that there's a lot of similarity in the conclusions that people come to.
Where do you see this heading, short and long term?
Well, in the immediate term, we are now releasing the findings of the first policymaking simulation that we did on Social Security. And here again, it was very striking that in all 3 states, a solid majority of Republicans and Democrats agreed on steps that eliminated most of the Social Security shortfall. The Social Security shortfall is a problem that Social Security faces, that if they don't do something about it, we're going to have a reduction in benefits before long. And so we presented this issue to them, and we had people evaluate options for addressing the Social Security shortfall. And what was really striking was this common ground that people found in all three states. Our goal next is to do some other topics. We have one in the field right now on the subject of negotiations with Iran. We'll also do one soon about the federal budget, dealing with the deficit and so on. And there will be other issues. We also are looking to expand into more states. And ultimately, we plan on having a citizen cabinet in every state and ultimately every district in the country.
Stephen Cull, founder and president of Voice of the People, thank you.
Thank you.
Here in Oklahoma, Voice of the People is being guided by our next guests. Cindy Simon Rosenthal, director of the Carl Albert Congressional Research and Studies Center and professor of political science at the University of Oklahoma, and Keith Gaddie, presidential professor and chairman of the Department of Political Science at the University of Oklahoma. Welcome to you both.
Thank you.
Keith Gaddie, why are so many voters disengaged?
Well, voters are disengaged because politicians don't engage them, in part. There's a lot of competition for voter attention. Life is busy. But when you are not approached to take part in politics, when you're not given meaningful information, when you're not given the chance to engage in a conversation, it's really hard to want to stay engaged. But the other problem is people are not giving meaningful information to make choices on. Instead, they're given basically a carnival show of negativism and Me Tooism and nasty fighting that doesn't contribute to a constructive solution. I was telling a lawmaker recently, would you want to do business with the people that you have to make legislation with? Would you do business with people that behave this way? And the answer was no.
Cindy Rosenthal, you're also mayor of Norman. How does lack of informed involvement in the political process affect public policy?
Well, it has a direct effect. And I want to second what Keith has said here about, I think voters are also turned off by the toxic nature of some of the discourse. But if we don't have citizens engaged at City Hall or at the legislative process or in the Congress, then we really don't have representative government, which is what we're talking about. And we really, to make tough choices, to make the big decisions that we need to bring people together rather than having them shouting from their different corners. And so that discourse becomes really very important.
Why do you think the citizen cabinet idea is worth pursuing?
Well, at the center, first of all, it's one of our central missions to promote citizen engagement and an informed public, because that does strengthen our institutions of representative government. But I think that too much of what citizens hear are either the talking points or the campaign literature that tends to drive people to polarized position. And I think that what the citizen cabinet does is try to take big issues and put people in the position of really thinking through the trade-offs, the implications, rather than the hard and fast positions that are being staked out by the partisans.
Keith, what appeals to you about this project?
Well, I mean, it really is a manifestation of what we do. First and foremost, this really started at the Carl Albert Center in terms of civic engagement, community engagement, but it's part of the general theme of the University of Oklahoma and of the study of politics at OU in general. We put a premium on civic engagement, community leadership, community engagement. Any student coming to OU that comes to our classes should be able to go out and seek information on an issue, identify important issues, and take leadership in their community and engage in the political process. It's part of our original charge going back to the Territorial College. So we do this in part because it's what we have been mandated to do by the people of the state. But it's also important to a healthy democracy. I mean, America is predicated on the notion of a healthy, informed debate. Ronald Reagan talked about this in his farewell speech, that we needed an informed patriotism where people came together around the kitchen table to discuss what was important and then to take action. And a citizen cabinet is just a kitchen table writ large for the larger community.
And to discuss issues and ideas and big ideas.
Absolutely.
Yes.
I thought it was interesting. Steve made the comment that the cabinet puts citizens into the shoes of politicians. I mean, I would take a little bit of an exception to that, because I think actually what the citizen cabinet does is reminds politicians of how citizens think about issues. And it's not about that polarized debate, but rather about let's get down to the nitty-gritty and solve problems.
How were the members of the Oklahoma Citizen Cabinet chosen?
It's a scientifically representative sample. They solicited participation through the OU Public Opinion Learning Lab, the OU poll. And it's intended to reflect really the diversity of both the state as a whole, but also they oversample the 4th District, Representative Cole's district, in order to just see whether or not the 4th District is reflective of the larger state opinion. But they worked very, very hard to make sure that it had that diversity of age, region, political background, and I think that's one of the beauties of this, is it really is intended to reflect the communities at large.
Stephen Cull mentioned that they're given reliable information. How important is that to this process?
Reliable information is very important because the public, to no small extent, often doesn't get reliable information before they're asked to respond on the basis of information. We survey people, we ask them questions about problems and issues, and often they don't have any actual knowledge. And there have been advocates, started out at Cal Berkeley, advocates who said what you need to do to really get a sense of public sentiment and public opinion is you first give the public knowledge and the opportunity to engage it, discuss it, see multiple and different arguments, then to reflect and make choices. And this really is a better model, so you don't get an uninformed opinion. I give you an example. There was a survey done once asking people whether or not we needed to intervene to end the genocide in Fredonia, which is a country that doesn't exist, right. Okay? Yeah, and people were, absolutely, we must intervene in Fredonia. We must intervene in Fredonia. Because people foot stomp on these issues without actual knowledge. We want an informed discourse. And part of how you get there, and Steve talked about this, is these briefings are deep briefings. These scenarios are deep scenarios where you have multiple different political perspectives, multiple different arguments advanced for people to make choices on. And that's better than what cable news gives them.
Right. I mean, in the 30-second soundbite, you're typically getting the black and white opposites. What the scenario public opinion polling does is really give people nuance. And hard choices are not about yes and no. They're really about trade-offs. And that's the beauty of this kind of polling. And the really neat outcome of this is that citizens actually find consensus and common ground.
Well, and here in Oklahoma, the issue was Social Security and possible fixes for that situation. And it did bring together Republicans and Democrats, and it appears that Oklahomans are more united than divided on this particular issue.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. I mean, for example, a couple of the quick results from that: 4 out of 5 of the people polled, and there was no real party difference between that, were willing to lower monthly benefits for at least the top 25% of earners, something that has been demonized in the public discourse as class warfare. I mean, Oklahomans saw that as one of several alternatives going forward to solve the long-term Social Security problem. Another example, 8 and 10 overall, and in both parties, were willing to consider raising the retirement rate for future retirees to 68. I mean, that's a remarkable consensus, getting 8 out of 10 from both parties agreeing to something like that. And then likewise, overwhelming majorities who supported the raising the amount of income that was subject to the payroll tax. Again, overwhelming majorities and some of those are tough trade-offs between the parties, but overwhelming majorities of both parties of citizens see them as necessary.
And outside of this process, you would probably get a lot of argument about those issues, but they came together in this scenario.
Yeah, and you know, what's kind of fun is, you know, we have to disentangle the arguments people see from the conversations they have. You know, cable TV news viewership is on the decline, especially in the evening, so the yelling head shows are less popular than ever across the board. But the conversation you get engaged in this poll is not unlike, you know, the old guys you see sitting down at the Brahms having coffee together. A lot of times they've done a little bit of homework and research, and they have these kind of conversations, and they'll bring these kind of facts up. But that kind of broad-based conversation doesn't always exist. And that's what this approach does, is it gives a depth of information and knowledge, and you learn things. The original retirement age for Social Security for full benefits was set equivalent to the median lifespan in the United States at the time the program was created. Yet our lifespans have grown longer, but we kept the retirement age the same. So we have increasing and longer demands on the program. We have fewer people paying in and more people taking out. But we're also living healthier, longer, better. So we can rethink our model for Social Security. This kind of survey gets at that, rather than just scaring people and saying it's going bankrupt and the politicians are stealing the money.
They also were in favor of increasing the minimum benefit.
Correct.
But COLAs were not recommended, changing COLAs.
That's correct.
Was not recommended. Did Republicans and Democrats differ appreciably? They came together ultimately on the bigger topics. Do you see a different dynamic, though, in the discussions in this kind of a setting?
I would say that on the margins there were a couple of issues where there were still some significant party differences, but I think what was remarkable about this first poll, this first scenario poll, was that majorities, strong majorities in both parties, were in favor of these consensus reforms. Again, you know, on one issue or another, it might be more strongly supported by Republicans than Democrats, but it was strong majorities overall.
And how do they conduct themselves? Did the people conduct themselves in a civil way? A citizen cabinet needs that, I would think, although there has to be some disagreement to actually get to a solution that both sides can agree on.
So the poll itself, though, is taken individually, and with the background that is provided by the Voice of the People and people like Stephen.
Those are the simulations.
The simulations, right.
Yeah.
But when we presented the first round of results, and as we will do in future rounds of results, we're convening here in Oklahoma public forums where we can have that kind of discussion. And in fact, the public forum on Social Security, which we had at the University of Oklahoma, engaged a lot of folks in discussion. And our results, we've sort of walked through the same questions, were quite similar to what the Citizen Cabinet. And so in that setting, when people can set aside, you know, and they want to learn more about the issue, it was a very civil discussion. It led to positive and consensus outcomes. So I think there's great promise for that kind of dialogue going in the future.
And Dick, I mean, this is part of the way you design the institution will in part dictate the nature of the conversation you can have. And the nature of this institution, of the Citizen Cabinet, puts the focus on the problem. And if you look at the physical design of Congress, of the chambers of Congress, the idea was to focus debate on the problem rather than on the opposition. Oftentimes when we talk about getting groups together in public, people think of those Tea Party protests where angry people showed up to yell at their congressmen, town halls, bad town halls. That's not going to happen here, because these are people who have decided, yes, there is a problem. And while we may have different solutions, we've come to focus on the problem rather than to vent our spleen at a decision maker who we disagree with. And that's the key, is the design of this institution is to try and find a solution.
Well, and as you mentioned, people did this individually, the simulations individually, but then what do you do with this information? You have done some checking with people to see how they feel about some of those solutions, but where does this go?
So on the front end of this process, the Voice of the People have reached out to our congressional delegation, to our senators and our congressmen. And as Stephen mentioned, Congressman Cole in particular has been quite interested in this process. I think that the next steps are to present this information to our elected representatives, to give them a space for creating the kind of dialogue that needs to take place on the floors of Congress. Right now, that space doesn't exist, but given information about what their constituents think and believe that does represent a consensus view, provides that space then for a different kind of dialogue to go forward.
So it gives them some insight and also some political cover should they need it.
Absolutely.
Yeah, you punch holes in the echo chamber, okay? So you get out of that beltway echo chamber where everybody thinks that the partisan voice they hear coming back at them represents the will of the people, okay? And there are two types of people when it comes to information and politics. There are people who use information and there are people who fear information. People who use information will take this political cover that Cindy was talking about and they will make use of it to carve out a new space where this hole's been punched in the echo chamber, and hopefully they move the debate and get to a solution. People who fear information, they will attack the technique, they'll attack the methodology, they'll attack the results, but the problem is they're going to discover they've run into really good operational science, and they're not going to be able to defeat the content.
Where do you see this methodology going? Do you see this being used? Stephen mentioned other issues coming up, but do you see this being used on a more broad-based level than what we're seeing right now?
I do know that Voice of the People aspires to have this methodology translated in every congressional district and every state. That takes resources, obviously, and a lot of wherewithal. So on the front end, we're part of the vanguard, if you will, to try to prove the efficacy of the methodology and the process in hopes that someone will come along and actually promote it to other funders, possibly, persuade a few congressmen maybe that this is not a bad idea to promote as a way of assessing public opinion.
Yeah. This is deep opinion and deep information, okay? It's representative and it has great depth to it, and that makes it useful. We have a deep diagnosis of the problem in this constituency, and that's good for decision makers to have. This is a broad-based representative group that's more than a focus group.
So not only will members of Congress and ultimately other elected officials receive this information on substance, particular issues and what people want to solve certain problems, but what does it do to the overall perception of the institution of government, specifically Congress, which has such a low popularity?
Yeah, we've noticed. Yeah, the Congress is not exactly our most popular institution these days, and so I think that there are members of Congress who are concerned about that. I mean, you can't continue to gain the legitimacy of the public and tackle these big issues unless you have the confidence of the public. So that is something that's out there. I think the process actually does also challenge members of Congress to look at the preferences of the middle as opposed to the preferences of the extreme, and that's something that we hope actually will come out of this. It's not an easy thing because members of Congress listen to their pollsters and their party leaders and their political advisors, but this at least presents some alternatives, and I think that's the key.
Yeah, and Cindy's hit another important point here, which is that we tend in the U.S. to actually trail the use of a lot of sources of information rather than leading the way. There are other countries around the world, notably in sub-Saharan Africa, where this method has been put to use to deal with fundamental issues like how do you put oil revenue to work in Nigeria? Bringing publics together, informing them, giving them scenarios, and getting them to express opinion, and informing decision makers that way. We tend to start with the assumption that if our consultant doesn't recommend it, it can't be right. But the consultants a lot of members of Congress rely on miss innovation, and then they have to come to the table late after they've been found wrong. So part of the goal here is to sell them on the method, which is sound, and then sell them on the content.
The demographics of the electorate are changing. Will this kind of an approach, a new kind of approach in advising government and advising policy, be more received by younger voters, perhaps by minority voters that haven't been quite so involved over the last several years, but are a growing part of the electorate?
Well, and I'm sure Keith has the same experience. One thing that concerns me as somebody who works with college-age students, millennials, I mean, we see a lot of them really turned off by what they see in the public realm. And so I think they're eager to see an alternative way of tackling problems and solving the big issues in front of us. So I think it will have a great deal of appeal. I also think that for many voters who are turned off by a political process that is dominated by big money, this also is appealing because it in that representative sits in cabinet. You weren't chosen because you had big money to pay candidates, and so I think there's an opportunity here to change that discourse, and it will appeal, I think, to people who are already concerned and somewhat disaffected.
Yeah, I mean, again, this goes back to you build new institutions for people to express themselves. People who didn't trust the old institutions will come and try out the new institutions. And this is an institutional design that lends itself to the types of tools that younger voters like to operate with, but also the types of tools that are increasingly available to people who were previously disfranchised or less likely to participate. The wonderful thing about the mobile phone device is it's a wonderful mobile interface. It's broadly available. It's become cheap. And it's a great vehicle to get people engaged and to access them. So the more that we can use both survey research, in-person briefing, focus group, the more we can integrate all this, the more we can bring these people who want to be involved to the table by giving them a new institutional vehicle.
Certainly, millennials are a growing part of the electorate. They're not very active at this point. And Oklahoma, by mid-century, is expected to be a majority-minority state in terms of its electorate. So does this suggest that the Oklahoma demographics not only are changing, but that Oklahoma politics will be changing over the next 20, 30, 40 years?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, it can't stand the same. And, Dick, we've talked about this in the past. You can't have a set of legislative policies being pursued and a politics that's this rancorous and divisive where the target are the very people who will be the electoral majority in the near future.
Well, Dick, you asked me at the outset about local government. I think this kind of scenario discussion and dialogue is really ready-made for local government and actually helps us hold at bay some of the forces that we've seen at the state capitol or in Congress of partisan polarization. So I see, promoting dialogue at the local level through, well, what are the trade-offs? How do we find common ground to be something that is really promising? So I, for one, look forward to having that kind of discussion.
And that's going to be the final word. Cindy, Simon, Rosenthal, Keith Gaddie, thanks for joining us on Oklahoma Forum.
Thank you.
Good to have you here. If you have a question, comment, or suggestion about a topic you'd like to see covered on Oklahoma Forum, let us know by email at forum@oeta.tv. You can also contact us and follow us on Twitter. Videos of Oklahoma Forum programs are on our website, and become an Oklahoma Forum fan on Facebook. Until next time, I'm Dick Pryor, and that's Oklahoma Forum.